Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with Paul Harrington. We're going to talk about business development for consulting firms, particularly in the public sector. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Well, great to join your show, and thanks so much for the opportunity today.
So, Paul, you had a really fascinating role, one that was new at McKinsey, and they created after I left the firm. You were helping to build up a kind of business development function at McKinsey that was sort of separate from the just line consultants who are doing execution, associate, engagement manager, partner, slightly separate from that. Tell us a little bit about that function that you were helping to build.
Sure. Well, thank you. Absolutely. It was a fantastic, opportunity, really, and experience. Spent about 9 years at the firm and was brought in to do exactly what you described, which is to build a go-to-market capability. Initially focused on the U.S. public sector, and so that was the U.S. federal government and state, local, and then later to scale it globally. So by the time I left, we had a team in 22 countries. And for those who might be listening who are familiar with McKinsey's culture, it was really a different capability that had not been developed before for the firm. And as you mentioned, there was a bit of cultural adjustment, if you will. But I think the foundation of building that team, and by go-to-market, I mean really across the client development lifecycle. So early stage business development into what in the public sector we call capture, which is taking a qualified opportunity and seeing it through to fruition and to eventually confirming work. It was something that, in building that team, we had to make sure that it was congruent with McKinsey's, tradition, values, culture, but also make sure that it was very entrepreneurial so that there was a return on investment, so to say, for that capability over time.
Great. So, of course, most listeners to this show would be familiar with the typical model of a McKinsey, Bain, BCG type of firm, where it's the associate partners and the partners who are out, working with people that they've known for a while, developing new clients. And then if they don't sell, of course, right? Nobody sells, but basically if they sell the work, then they're going to be the partner who's responsible for overseeing it. But this was a different model. And I can imagine some reasons of why it would make sense. But rather than just me guessing, walk me through how it's different doing business development in the public sector and why it makes sense for a consulting firm to have someone who's just focused on that and not, getting distracted also by the execution piece. Maybe it's sort of ability to pay attention to it over a longer sales cycle, but just like walk us through what are some of the differences with the public sector.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think first in terms of, just the environment, the government, whether it's the federal government or the state government within a particular state, it's a monopsony, right? It's a single buyer system. And so that in the particulars of public sector, which I'll get into in a moment, really generate different requirements. And so one is, of course, strong adherence to procurement regulations. And that is much more so than maybe a lot of folks in private sector are used to. So the idea that you have to be compliant, in other words, address exactly what the government wants, responsive, really answering the mail, but also really compelling to differentiate yourself, from others, really, really important. And non-compliant proposals in particular are automatically disqualified. And for those who were raised in that McKinsey, BCG, Bain kind of mindset, the first step, of course, in any process is always problem definition. And the problem is that if you get a request for proposal and decide that you're going to reframe the problem in the proposal response, likely will result in disqualification. So how do you, make sure that you're answering and compliant, but also still giving a distinctive answer that's really going to allow, that firm to eventually go to the government and have, a high degree of impact. So one is the strong adherence on procurement regulations. I think second is, and you alluded to this earlier, is that procurement cycle length. Sometimes it can be relatively short, a month or two. more often than not, it's really measured in months and sometimes even in years. And so the implication there is that a portfolio approach is really necessary in order to offset different cycle times, right, and sustainably grow a government body of work. And then the idea is that the teams taking a portfolio approach, they engage with clients early and then really throughout the process. And I would say that if you're contemplating a go-to-market team with your consulting organization, the idea is that these folks can really be force multipliers, right? That they are the ones who can really help bridge the gaps when your associate partners and partners get really busy with delivery, to really help make sure that we're moving the ball down the field relative to these engagements, client development opportunities over a long period of time. I think third would be heightened level of public disclosure. And so with taxpayer funds comes, that idea that there is more accountability. So it's easier for competitors and the public to obtain information in the US through the Freedom of Information Act and other disclosure laws. And that can be both a blessing and a curse, in the sense that you can certainly, you're more susceptible to disclosure, but you can also learn a lot more. So there's a tremendous amount in general of information out in the public domain on your clients, on your competitors, much more so than probably your average private sector industry. And then just two more. One would be the potential for conflicting objectives in the decision-making process. So for those of us at management consulting firms, typically you are approaching the very senior level sponsors, the C-suite, if you will. And that's certainly true in the government as well. But there are two other constituencies that are equally as important. One is that evaluation committee, which are probably N-3 or 4 from that senior level decision maker. They're the ones that are actually going to make that competitive award decision. And then procurement as well. And oftentimes procurement or contracting officers may have different incentives, for example, wanting to avoid what's called a protest or to obtain discounts, et cetera. They may have different incentives than what we typically think of as clients might have as well. And then finally, I would say that access to framework agreements, master supplier agreements, and there are a variety of names of those in the government space, and I'll try to avoid alphabet soup here, but access to those frameworks is extremely important in order to get the quote unquote hunting license in order to be able to compete for work. So in a nutshell, those are some of the major differences between public sector and a lot of other private sector industries.
Could you elaborate a bit on the incentives for those procurement officers? Just say a little bit more about that.
Sure, absolutely. So, if you think of the senior level sponsor and the folks on the mission side, if you will, or the business side, making that evaluation, they're generally speaking trying to make sure that they're getting the best fit along technical or management requirements in terms of what's laid out in the request for proposal. So they obviously want to get the mission done. They want to select ideally the best industry partner to get something done, a reorganization, org transformation, procurement spend analysis, you name whatever type of engagement. Whereas contracting certainly has a duty, to help that process. But a lot of times depends on the agency and the metrics they're using. But they are oftentimes graded, if you will, evaluated on their ability to get discounts. They are looking at it oftentimes through more of a price-sensitive lens than perhaps others. And also in the government, there's this phenomenon known as protest, which is essentially the idea that if I win work and say that you're a competitor and you're not happy about that for whatever reason, you get your debrief and you decide, you know what, I really am going to challenge the government's decision. That's known as a protest. And protests tend to delay awards, sometimes up to 100 days. They can get extended out even further. And as a result, it really creates a tremendous amount of additional hassle to work, especially for the contracting officer. So they want to try to avoid that. So there are the different incentives around cost/price, around avoiding protest, and around making sure that the integrity of the process is upheld, that sometimes results in different opinions on what type of competitive selection they're going to make.
And I have no knowledge of this really at all, of this dynamic. So help me understand a bit, like, how does the decision process work? You mentioned there's like an evaluation committee, but there's also the procurement officer. Does sort of the eval committee look at things and say, okay, we want to go with firm B, and then they just say, procurement officer, go ahead and sign up firm B? Or is it like a collaborative thing where they both have to say yes? Just like, how does that whole decision process work?
Sure. No, it's a great question. So I think that they ideally are collaborative. They're certainly working together. The way I would depict is if I could just start from the moment they receive proposals from offers. So the government has put out a request for proposal or something similarly named. A number of players in industry respond to that proposal or respond to the request for proposal, submit a proposal, and those that are deemed so, they'll do an initial check to say, okay, who's compliant? Let's say that 7 firms bid, 7 firms are compliant, then begins the technical evaluation. So what will happen is this evaluation committee, which can vary in number, anywhere from 3 or 4 for large proposals, maybe up to 7 or 8 folks, not including the contracting officer, they will essentially be sequestered. They'll have all those technical proposals to evaluate on their own. And then they will get together with the other members of the committee, as well as the contracting officer, to sit, essentially in a room, virtual or otherwise, to then determine who has, the most strengths, the least weaknesses or deficiencies, and come up with a recommendation. The contracting officer, along with a subset perhaps of that technical evaluation committee, will look at the price proposal, which is a separate document, a separate volume. And so they will make their own determination of what's called, quote unquote, fair and reasonable in terms of what the price is. And essentially they have that price reasonable, or that fair and reasonable range. They basically determine parameters. So the floor, if you will, is what's called price realism. And what that means is that if someone bid too low, they either don't understand the requirement, or perhaps they're trying to bait and switch, in which case it's just not credible from a price perspective. Price reasonableness, which you could think of as kind of the ceiling, is that the philosophy is a reasonable person would not necessarily pay significantly more for the same services as others. So within those two parameters, you get this range of what is considered fair and reasonable. More often than not, they're making what's called, is certainly for consulting services, are making what's called a best value decision, meaning that they don't necessarily have to go with the lowest price. They're going to go for the best overall value of the government. So if someone can show that they are technically more distinctive in a significant way, that could potentially justify a higher price to be awarded. But what will happen is that committee will meet, they'll have their recommendation. This is all, of course, sealed. The contracting officer will come in with his or her recommendation, and then they'll reconcile and then eventually make an award. Once they make an award, they will notify those that were not successful, and it varies based on the size, et cetera, but they may offer what's called a debrief, either in written form, you get a letter explaining your strengths and weaknesses of the proposal, or it might be an oral debrief where they will have, pre-COVID at least, people in a physical room, or certainly these days over Zoom, what have you, to debrief. And then from there, each party can decide what they're going to do next. In other words, just accept the decision or potentially protest. I would say, last point maybe here, is that protests are generally not very successful. Probably less than 10% of the time are they, overall, are they successful when they're protesting an award decision. So it's not a wonderful strategy unless you really feel as though you've been wronged. Protests have a kind of a deleterious effect on the relationship, if you will, with the clients you're trying to serve.
I'm curious your perspective. To what degree do the clients in the government have kind of some favored firm that they really just want to use, frankly, and they have to go through all this RFP business because of requirements, but then, but then they're sort of behind the scenes, like just trying to really steer it to one firm? To what degree does that happen? And like, how much leeway do they have, either in sort of maybe shaping the RFP so that one firm is clearly favored, or, in sort of the reviewing process to kind of just say, we did this to check the box, but really we want to go with, firm D or something?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's certainly the party line from anybody you would speak to in government would say, that doesn't happen, or we're running a fair process, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the vast majority do really bend over backwards to run a fair procurement process. And I do, that said, though, before the RFP is issued, in what's called the market research phase. There are opportunities in it, and it's very compliant with all the right regulations, what's called the Federal Acquisition Reg of the U.S. federal government and others, where you can meet with clients both on the acquisition side, the contracting side, but also the mission side, to really talk about what your firm's capable of doing. And there are clauses that actually allow, again, in the proper channels, to submit market research input. So the idea of weighing in on, here's, Department of Commerce or Department of Defense or whomever, here are the ways you may want to think about this. So firms can't, kind of unduly influence the process, but there are legitimate channels for them to submit input ahead of time to kind of establish an impression. People are human. I think people may establish folks that they might favor or not, but they're really not allowed, if they're running the right process, they're not allowed to really steer it in any which way. I think what they can do is evaluate everybody, but there's oftentimes where the favorite, quote unquote, ends up not being the winner because they just didn't survive or they didn't do the best in the process. So doing really well ahead of the request for proposal is no guarantee of actually winning it, but it's, really doing your best. I would say the inverse, which is, responding to a request for proposal where you haven't met the clients well ahead of time, again, when it's allowed and all that, results in a very low P win, a very low probability of win, right? Because they just don't know who you are, et cetera. Oftentimes, I think clients will probably establish a consideration set of a few firms that are probably likely successful bidders, but again, it needs to be proven out in the process. And I'd say the vast majority of government folks, really, follow that in a very strict way. But that doesn't mean that they don't have their inclinations, but it really needs to go through that rigorous procurement process.
So that's an interesting thing that you said, which is that the firms that have not met one-on-one and had that part of the market research process or know them already, you can submit an RFP, but even if it looks good on paper, your chances are pretty low because you haven't had that personal interaction yet.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not impossible, but I think especially, when you think of your listeners here in terms of management consulting firms, for the type of work and the type of impact that this, generally speaking, everyone's work represents, the idea of somebody kind of saying, essentially throwing the keys to you and say, great, go for it. I haven't met you before to do it. It's very, I'd say it's a very much a lower probability. Again, not impossible, but I do think even for very well-known big firms, the probability of winning, I think, when they haven't been able to provide some market research input or meet beforehand is very low.
Yeah. So the important lesson for me there is if you have not met in person, don't waste your time submitting a proposal because your chances are pretty low. So if you're going to do a proposal, make sure that you've actually had a chance to meet with them in person. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels.
Right, some meaningful interaction, absolutely. Right, on the core content of whatever the scope is, absolutely. And that is something that I was a big, that advice. Will, I think you're spot on. That's something I used to give advice in not just McKinsey but other places I've worked as well. And there are typically review processes in many firms that say, look, if we haven't had a chance to really interact with the client and they don't really have any understanding of how we're applicable for this, and the first time they're hearing about us is the proposal response, our chance is extremely low. Some folks do want to do it as a result, it's a way to kind of get in front of the client, maybe, do that, but I do think it's not the best use of time, personal opinion.
Seems to me that the process makes it difficult to, perhaps to become a trusted advisor with a government client the way you can with a corporate client. In the corporate world, you start serving someone, it's slightly different than a friendship, but you become a trusted advisor if you're lucky, in David Meister's phrase. And then, it's not like they're just going to put some technical evaluation out there to the universe. They want you in particular because you understand them, they trust you, and so forth. And if you have to kind of do this RFP every time, it's like this very arm's length interaction. It makes it much more transactional.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think, definitely thinking of Meister's work when he describes the attributes of trusted advisor, where, price isn't an issue and you've got, kind of, you're not really worried about proposals, et cetera, those kinds of things. That I think is true. But I do think the idea of having a trusted advisor relationship, developing that, I do really believe that is possible. At the same time, the ability to win new work still needs to go through more formal processes. But this idea that, wow, Will meets with, whomever, the deputy secretary of agency X, and has developed that trusted relationship, maybe based on engagements you had one, et cetera. Absolutely. The other compensating factor, I think, is a lot of these engagements and framework agreements tend to be very long from a length perspective. So in other words, you might compete for what they call a blanket purchase agreement, which is a framework agreement, might have a 5-year period of performance, and you win tasks, engagements on that. So over time, you'll have to compete for those tasks potentially, but you can still develop long-term trusted relationships with folks. But it is going to, on the commercial side, is going to look a little different than how Meister, of course, describes it in his book.
Okay, great. Gosh, I have so many questions I want to ask you. A
Great.
lot of listeners to this show, of course, are independent professionals. That was
Sure.
part of our subtitle. And what is your thoughts on the possibility for someone running a boutique firm or an independent professional to get contracts directly with federal, state, or local government? Is it even possible? If so, how do you go about it? Or do you suggest trying to go through some like larger intermediary with a blanket purchase agreement to kind of go under their wing? Like, talk to me about that. Is it possible as for an independent professional to get this agreement with the federal government? It sounds pretty hard.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the net is it possible? Absolutely, and I would characterize it in maybe one of two ways. One would be coming in direct as an independent professional, and then another, as you alluded to, as a teammate. And for those who haven't been around public sector as much, one other characteristic is that teaming, meaning partnering with other firms, is much more prevalent, either because, hey, I'm a small firm or I'm a solo practitioner and this requires more scale and I want to kind of pull in other teaming partners to kind of get work done, either together on individual tasks or have different end item responsibility, but we can do that. So I think that is certainly one. There also might be, the government has what they call small disadvantaged businesses, which get preferential treatment. So there's different categories. So there might be service disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, hub zones. Those are historically underutilized business zones, women-owned small businesses, et cetera. So there's lots of different designations that folks can look into to see if their firm qualifies, first of all, which helps. And in some of those cases, the government actually allows sole sources. That means awards without competition to happen, and they could be pretty significant. Some of those sole sources are allowed up to $5 million in value, right? So there are really opportunities there for folks to do that. As an independent practitioner, I think one part of it is picking your spots, right? In other words, if it's the big, huge org transformation where you need, you're doing this, I'm going to make this up, for the State Department, you need a global presence in at least, 30 countries, obviously not for a solo practitioner. Although, depending upon the expertise, a solo practitioner might help a larger firm actually accomplish that. But it might be other things where it's like, we need concentrated effort for this, small financial regulatory agency to do an IT strategy. Or again, I'm just making up these examples, but the idea is that one or two people or one person augmented with a 1099 or two can actually go forth and do that. So I think that, what the government's looking for a lot of times is past performance. So that's the idea of saying, not only do I have this expertise, but I've actually done it in place X, Y, and Z. That is a piece of it. I think also, certain things are competed on certain what they call contracting vehicles. Those are those hunting licenses I mentioned. So the idea of meeting people that may have those vehicles and saying, hey, this is a really interesting piece of work. I'm very qualified for it. I'm going to reach out and start, my BD process. Can we potentially partner on this? So there are ways. It certainly requires creativity, but there are absolutely ways to be able to do that. And I think what's really inspiring to me is the mission of these different agencies at the local, state, or federal level. And depending upon everyone's interests, there's just so many ways to have impact and to really help advance a mission. So I think it's, I'm a little biased, but I would say that it's absolutely worth looking into for those who are interested in, are willing to kind of take a through cycle mindset.
For an independent professional that's maybe a bit intimidated by going through the whole like process of trying to become a prime vendor, are there ways to search for opportunities to become a teammate? Like, is there any kind of directory of people with a blanket agreement or thing where you can find those opportunities?
Oh, absolutely. There's lots of different services. Some are free, some are paid subscriptions to be able to find other firms that do that. So on the free side, if you were to go to what's called sam.gov, sam.gov, unfortunately the user interface is sometimes a little bit challenging, but that's one where you can look up opportunities. You can look up, that's what the government's actually competing. You can look up different vendor profiles as well. You've got other places like Bloomberg Gov, BGov as it's called, where, paid subscription, but again, really compendious, what do I want to say, kind of archives, if you will, of different companies that play in different spaces. What, for example, NICS codes they have, those are North America Industry Classification codes in terms of what they specialize in, where they play. And there's a lot available there. And there are a number of other sites like that. And I'm happy to provide, if it's helpful, Will, more of a kind of a comprehensive list of different links people can use just to go investigate and find out what it is. But absolutely. Another one that I really encourage is the GSA, General Services Administration, what's called e-library. And that one as well lists about the 2,400 or so firms that have what's called a GSA schedule. That again, what kind of scope areas do they have access to? So there are ways to do some investigative work, in some cases without spending any money, just to, kind of triangulate and develop hypotheses on whom you might want to approach.
That's great. And if you happen to be running a practice and you're classified as either a minority-owned business, women-owned business, veteran-owned business, disabled veteran business, then one of these prime firms, if I'm correct, sometimes they may have a requirement to farm out some percentage of that business to some small, like, one of these categories of smaller businesses.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
So they may be like, delighted to meet you because you help them meet their diversity requirements.
Absolutely. And, with the quality of independent professional you have within Umbrex, I think that prime contractors would be delighted, right, to meet folks that bring the level of sophistication, expertise that, that folks here have. I think is really, really important. Absolutely. And they absolutely do. There are sometimes where there are dictated socioeconomic requirements or a small business plan where they actually spell out the percentage of work that you're supposed to give to these different firms. And again, there are also sometimes small business set-asides. And that's as a prime where they say, we want somebody under X revenue or X number of people in their firm, or alternatively, it's just a set aside for a particular type of small disadvantaged business. And so there's really a lot of opportunity there as well.
Okay. I would like to hear a little bit about your practice now. So since you left McKinsey, my understanding is that some of your work is you help consulting firms do something similar, but more as an outside advisor, helping firms, get government contracts, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So yes, just started, and actually I do fall into one of those categories. So Pathfinder Consulting Group, LLC is the name of my firm. And it is a certified veteran-owned small business, and that's through the official certification bodies, the Department of Veterans Affairs. So I'm a former Army officer from a long, long time ago, but basically veteran-owned small business. And to your point, well, I just love building, whether it's building within my own organization or building and helping others, grow their own organizations. And so I really do have a passion for, call it go-to-market, right? Go-to-market strategy, operating model, as deal coaching, et cetera, in terms of helping people, really expand. And so that part of Pathfinder is really about either helping firms that are brand new to the government space on a global level, U.S. federal, state, local, et cetera, in terms of helping them, accelerate, get up to speed, or existing players who really just need a fresh set of eyes, right, to look, or there might be particular pain points in their current organization to help turn around and fix that. And so that's really a big area of focus. And then the idea is to also eventually serve some government clients as well on strategy and digital modernization topics. But as I've just started a little while ago, the initial piece has really been helping. And for example, my first client as a solo practitioner was a firm that, highly expert in their given discipline, did a lot within the private sector, had served government sporadically over time, and in this particular case was going after an extremely sizable program. Commercially, it was huge from a dollar perspective, but impact-wise, it's something that will impact many, many Americans when it comes to wireless access. And so the idea was how to help really differentiate and position them for success. So that's just an example, but there's lots more where, firms, again, that are thinking about market entry into different countries or delving into the U.S. federal market, for example. Those are the kinds of things where, I love helping solve those challenges.
Curious about one aspect of this for a consulting firm that's thinking about dealing with the government at any of these levels. I had a small amount of exposure to this. I once did a project that was sort of a performance improvement, lean operations thing for a government contractor working with their contracting group. And that was like 200 people. And so I saw a little bit of how this, talk to us about some of the capabilities that you need to have on your side a contracting officer who can do like the change requests in the right way. And, there was like all these compliance type requirements of how you submit your invoice and how you have to do a change order request if you need to go over. So what sort of capabilities should you be thinking about that you need to have in place if you're going to try to, engage with the federal government?
Yeah. Well, Will, I'm very impressed. It sounds like you had quite the experience there already with that. But I would say, yeah, absolutely. So when you're building, or anyone's thinking about building that, scaling, let's say, that growth organization, you might kind of put it into a few different categories. And so one would be, if I start with, what you just mentioned, what I more or less call the enabling our infrastructure, right? So those are folks that are contracts managers. In other words, they're really managing the contract in what we kind of call, quote unquote, cradle to grave. So that's anywhere from helping submit requests for information, that's market research input, et cetera, and submitting a proposal on behalf of the organization to helping negotiate during the process. Oftentimes the government will come back for what's called a BAFO, or a best and final offer. So the negotiating process and then the award, and then managing the contract throughout its life cycle, and eventually through the final phase, what we call contract closeout. So that's certainly one. Legal is another one, whether they're in-house counsel or external counsel. Even big firms in the space do retain outside counsel to help with protests and maybe other specific areas as well. Pricing, compliance, there's a lot of different pieces of infrastructure that would go there. Then on that growth layer, you think about folks that really focus on business development or capture. And for example, in the case of McKinsey, we hired colleagues who really were kind of hybrid BD capture folks. They really had the skill sets and expertise to really go across that entire client development lifecycle. And then also proposal management. And so those are folks that really help spearhead and organize the proposal process, and oftentimes might do some tech writing as well. So for consulting firm, by nature, we're problem solvers. By nature, we're going to want to focus on content. However, that won't do any good if we don't have a compliant proposal, as I mentioned earlier. So that idea of the proposal manager working hand in hand with that client service team to create, to harness that knowledge and expertise to create content that is going to really resonate with the client. So those are certainly not an exhaustive list, but I think those are I think those two categories cover, probably 80, 90% of what's needed when you're talking about building out that growth organization focused on government.
Illustrate for us some examples of what might cause your proposal to be non-compliant. I imagine there could be some real frustrating things like, oh, you didn't have this one appendix, or it wasn't like the right font or something. What are some things that actually in real life you've seen, disqualify
Oh,
proposals?
oh, absolutely. No, unfortunately, I have not been a party to it, but I have seen one where, somebody forgot to include, it was probably a, 300-page proposal, and they forgot like Appendix H or whatever letter it was. They did not sign one form and basically were disqualified for, this is not McKinsey, this is another firm in industry who, basically I think the total contract value was about $600 million over 10 years. And the entire proposal was disqualified. And they had probably spent, with their internal resources and external resources, they had probably spent several $100,000 on the proposal, right? So that's a very painful example. But there are other ones that aren't quite as painful, but the idea that the pricing didn't match up, right? Or that just certain things weren't addressed. And I think, again, going back to our proclivity to reframe problems, I've seen examples where, a team decided that they were going to reframe the problem and, hey, that RFP is great, but you guys really didn't frame the problem correctly. Here's how we think you should think about the problem. To which the government responds, great, one less proposal to evaluate, you're qualified, because that's not at all how we want it. You're not giving us what we want, and you're giving us things we didn't ask for. I've also seen certainly consulting firms fall into the trap of giving too much. What I mean by that is they ask for 3 resumes and you give them 20, right? That becomes kind of irritating to evaluators, because if they've got 10 proposals to evaluate and now you've just given them a bunch of extra pages, they may just disallow it and still consider the proposal. But by not following instructions, they have the right to disqualify. So there's a number of examples there where, folks have just forgotten. And again, quality control, people get tired towards the latter stages of the proposal. They miss something, they duplicate a section and forget to include, this required piece as well. And I think the biggest thing I'd say overall, though, would be just, not having an outline, not having a dot dash, if you will, that is easily gradable, if you will, by the government, right? If they have to hunt and search and try to do that, it makes life a lot harder for them. And a lot of times the contracting officer may just say, we found these areas to be lacking, and so that's disqualified.
Yeah. So if there's requirements 1 through 23, your proposal should have section 1, 2, 3 up through section 23 and match it up 1 to 1. So
Right.
it's easy to check the boxes.
Right. It may sound a little Fisher Price, color by the numbers kind of stuff, but I do think that it is important to make sure it is very digestible by the evaluators. But at the same time, within that, and it's going to feel, by the way, for those who are raised at management consulting firms, it's, to use the McKinsey frame, it's not going to feel messy, right? It's going to feel a little repetitious, maybe not exhaustive, but the idea is to get comfortable with that discomfort, if you will, and be able to say, okay, we are going to put this in a way that's framing in a way that they can digest, but at the same time, we are really within those parameters, we're really going to show, how we can be distinctive in whatever area it is.
Fantastic. Well, Paul, this is such a huge topic. It's really cool hearing about like how this very particular approach of like what you need to do to be successful in this space. For folks that wanted to follow up with you, learn more about your firm, do you want to share a website or email address or any way for people to learn more about what you do and get in touch?
Absolutely, absolutely. And my profile is up on the Umbrex site, and my email is Paul, Paul, Harrington, that's HARRINGTON, and then all one word, Pathfinder Consulting LLC.com. And that is also the URL. So Pathfinder Consulting LLC.com is the URL for my website. So be happy to chat with anyone. Absolutely. I think it's the more that people that get bitten by the bug, so to say, of public sector, I think it really benefits the governments to bring this kind of great expertise to them. And I think that there is a push to want to get new talent and to get new views in. So this is actually a pretty timely topic.
Fantastic. Well, Paul, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Well, it's a pleasure. And thank you again.